Hey, good people. It's Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. What's today, February 11th?
February the 11th.
February 11th, 2017. Good Saturday afternoon to you. Thanks for listening to us. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for clicking. Thanks for watching. Thanks for even thinking about us. We really do appreciate that. So happy to be here today. I'm your host, Atiba Buchanan. My co-host here, Mr. David Seaton. And we've got a lot to talk about this week. It was so hard this week, man, trying to narrow down what to talk about.
There's no shortage of news.
None. And that's what makes this job so much fun is being able to share this. But man, I mean, there's so many things that are important to so many people. So we're just going to kind of jump right into it. We got a couple things going on today. We were going to, let me offer an apology because on Facebook, I had posted that we'd be talking about Jeff Sessions today.
Right.
We ended up having to switch guests and ended up switching the topic. So we will not be discussing Jeff Sessions. We'll try and get that in next week, but who knows what the news cycle will be like, so we'll see. But we definitely will have a conversation regarding him, I'm sure, about something related to the Justice Department soon enough. But today, we're going to talk about, at the top of the hour today, we'll be talking about the nomination and the confirmation then of Betsy DeVos, the Education Secretary, and what we can expect from that.
The anti-education secretary.
I love it. I love it. So yeah, what are your initial thoughts on her, Dave, just off the top of your head?
Well, it was the first secretary in history where the vice president had to cast the deciding vote.
Absolutely. History in the making, right?
That says everything you need to know right there, how controversial this nominee was.
Absolutely. Did you catch any of her hearings?
I did. Al Franken let her have it.
He did.
She was not able to keep up. When she actually, the next day that she actually got, was that the day after she got sworn in, she tried to go to some elementary school, and the protesters were blocking her from getting into the school.
Yes, and did you see her face? She was completely stunned walking back to her vehicle. That was an amazing moment. And let me just be clear, you know, I got a chance to see the hearings. And what the hearings did was show just how inept and how unqualified she was. And that's what the resistance is about. A lot of people want to make it about partisan politics. Well, this is just Democrats obstructing. And that isn't the truth. This lady is wholly unqualified for the position that she now has.
If you want anyone who's listening, if you want confirmation of how unqualified Betsy DeVos is, Google Betsy DeVos, and you will see kind of her little mini bio.
Sure.
Says she's a philanthropist. Says she's a businesswoman. You know, there's a couple of things. She's probably got 4 or 5 things listed. None of them are anything related to education.
Right.
So again, to not have any experience in education and to be the Secretary of Education, but we have someone with no experience sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So,
well, I thought you were going to go to Ben Carson.
Well, I try not to bring him up. I'm trying to watch my blood pressure. I can't talk about Ben Carson.
Because, but again, that speaks to a larger narrative to the resistance of the Trump nominees. Because once again, people try and make it about partisan politics, and that isn't the case. Obama was obstructed based on, as you would say, principle, based on who he was.
Right.
Trump is being obstructed based on what he does.
Correct.
Not because of who he is. So again, he is now, for the too many times to count, placed someone in a position of authority that has no idea or that has no experience or background in that particular position. So yeah, I mean, some people will say, his supporters will say, you know, well, that's what needs to happen. It needs to be shaken up.
Shake up the system.
Right, shake up the system. But you know, there's a difference in shaking up the system and destroying it.
Right.
And so I'm very curious to see what's going to happen in the next, you know, months and years ahead, watching the Trump presidency with these picks that he has. I really want to talk about Jeff Sessions this week, but we will come back. We will come back to that. So joining us momentarily is going to be Kevin Kumashiro. He is the former dean of education at the University of San Francisco. He wrote an amazing piece on Betsy DeVos and how we can, titled "How Can You Pick a Better Education Secretary?" And we're going to talk to him about, because he gave actually a 4-point program as to how to pick an education secretary. It was a very interesting read. So I can't wait to get him on the line and help our listeners, help us all better understand this. So we're going to take a break. Thank you so much for joining us. You can give a call if you have any questions at 708-223-8953. And thank you for watching Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. Back. Thank you for sticking with us. Again, you're watching Humanity in the Headlines. Today, I'm your host, Atiba Buchanan, along with my co-host, David Seaton. And right now, we're going to discuss the Trump confirmation for Education Secretary, Ms. Betsy DeVos. On the line with us right now, we are glad to have Mr. Kevin, I want to make sure I say this right, Kumashiro.
That's right.
Excellent, excellent. We have Kevin Kumashiro, who's on the line with us. He is the former Dean of Education at the University of San Francisco, and he is also an author. He wrote a book, Bad Teacher, How Blaming Teachers Distorts the Bigger Picture. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So if you could just, before we even get into Betsy DeVos, I'd like our listeners to know a little bit more about you. If you could just tell us maybe a 30-second blip on your background, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was a teacher. I've taught in the U.S. as well as in the Peace Corps abroad. I've taught teachers in university programs. Most recently, I was Dean of the School of Education, and a lot of my work focuses both on how to teach in ways that address inequities in education, as well as looking at school reform and education policies and where we seem to go wrong when we try to make things better.
So you were actually a teacher. So you're saying you were a teacher. Now we're going to actually talk about teaching, but you actually have a background in teaching, right?
Yes, which is unfortunate that so many of our leaders that we turn to do not have experience either as teachers or as educational leaders, but somehow we think that they can bring expertise into education just because they have maybe a lot of money or have a lot of experience lobbying educators.
Exactly, and that was my point. I wasn't trying to belittle the fact that you were a teacher. I was just highlighting that you're actually an expert in the field that we'll be discussing today. So I wish we had more of that in our government, but oh well. So, excuse me, I think I'm gonna need some water. So nonetheless, we'd like to talk to you about Betsy DeVos, and I got a chance to read your piece. I thought it was an amazing piece, how to pick a better education secretary than Betsy DeVos. And you talk about 4 principles for choosing the next U.S. Secretary of Education. Let's go ahead and enlighten our listeners about those 4 principles. I thought they were excellent.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I wrote this piece that actually draws on a declaration that now over 230 deans of schools of education from across the country have endorsed, that basically says that the rhetoric as well as the track record of our current leaders are really taking us in the wrong direction. And we want to present 4 principles that we as a nation need to rally around if we really want to see improvements in public education. And so really briefly, the first principle is about saying that public education, public schools need to be a public good. They cannot be they cannot be thought of as a commodity where people who have more resources can afford to buy a better schooling than the masses. We need to return to the vision for public schools that some of our earliest leaders in this country, like Thomas Jefferson, were clarifying, which is that every child should be able to walk to his or her neighborhood public school and get the very best that our nation has to offer. Schools should be a foundation of building democracy, not a privilege for only those with the most resources.
Now, if I could stop you there, first of all, I think that's a great principle, and we're going to delve more into that. There's a quote that I'd like to from the article that I'd like to let everyone hear that I thought really honed in on the difference really between what I find to be Democrats and Republicans and how they view education, generally speaking. But it says in the article, it says we need a vision for public education that will not deepen the divide between the haves and have-nots. Every child should be able to receive the very best that our country has to offer, regardless of his or her circumstances at birth. And I think that is an excellent summation, right?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the way we build a stronger nation is we ensure that everyone has the absolute best that our nation has to offer, and that you're not given something different just because the circumstances of your birth or the groups that others want to peg you into, which actually leads to our second principle, right? That the federal government has a central role in ensuring that we are advancing human and civil rights through the education system. We seem to have lost sight of the history of schools, which is, first of all, that schools were actually never created to level the playing field. When we first created public schools in this country, we actually created them for only the most elite. And as we began to incorporate more and more students into schools, we just came up with more and more ways to sort them. So the rhetoric around public education might be that our purpose is to provide equal educational opportunity. But the reality is that the function has often been to sort and differentiate students. So when the federal government became more involved in public schooling around the middle of the 20th century, their involvement was very specific. It was to advance human and civil rights. So historians call the period from the 1950s to the late 70s, early 80s, it's called the federal era in education. And it's because it's when the federal government finally stepped in and took a very, very strong role in advancing civil rights through things like the Civil Rights Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. There's laws around students with disabilities, bilingual students. There's laws around gender discrimination, language discrimination. And in the most recent reauthorization of the federal law, in the most recent rhetoric we hear from federal leaders, we seem to be backpedaling from that history. We seem to be saying, no, the federal government doesn't have a big role to play. Let's just rely on the states and the locals. And we are trying to say in this document and in my article that, no, let's remind ourselves that the federal government shouldn't be micromanaging, but it should be putting forward a very bold vision that insists that education is a human right for every child, and that we will ensure that discrimination and harassment and inequity do not continue to define American schooling.
Well, of course we're backpedaling because we have to make America great again, right? And it's so ominous that you also cited that from the 1950s, because but go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to jump in. This is David, and thank you for joining us today. I was looking at in researching for this conversation, the Census Bureau released new public education finance data. And in 2013, they show the disparity between funding of education by state. And it says that nationwide in the United States, the average we spend on per capita per student is about $10,700. But when you actually dig into the numbers on the high end in New York, for example, we spent $19,800 per capita, and on the low end in Utah, we spent $6,500. So you always hear from the right that it's not about money. We spend more than enough money on education, but just like you were just mentioning just a moment ago, that finances or that wealth shouldn't be the barrier to being able to get a basic quality education. Kind of comment on that disparity by state and by region and where you live in the country. And it gets down as micro in the state of Illinois, where a lot of education locally is funded by property taxes. So if you live in the wrong place in this country, you don't get a good public school education.
Yeah, I think you've just so nailed on the head one of those really, really problematic aspects of U.S. schooling, which is that the vast majority of our funding across the country comes from local property taxes. So if you live in a wealthier neighborhood, you are getting a much more well-financed schooling. And while many of us would say that money isn't the only issue, which it isn't, we cannot deny that resources are a huge issue and cannot be ignored as a central reason why our schools are so inequitable and so different for different populations of students, right?
All right, so we're going to move it along. I want you to go ahead and finish going through your other two tenets, and because we actually have to get to the meat of the matter, which is Betsy DeVos. But again, I think the information in the article again it will just be edifying to our audience. So go ahead with the other principles.
Yeah, I think our third principle was about making sure that we are drawing on research and that we're not relying on rhetoric. I think we so often are looking for those magic bullets, those like easy solutions for how we improve education, which ends up taking us in the wrong direction. And I'll just foreshadow a little bit about my comments about DeVos by saying, look, the problem is that this administration is not a 180-degree shift from where we've been going in the past. The reality and the unfortunate reality is that both Democrats and Republicans have been pushing us in this direction of privatizing, of marketizing schools, of looking for these easy magic bullets like high-stakes testing that actually don't have any research to back them up. So we're trying to say, let's actually do our homework. Let's make sure we're looking at the research to avoid going down solutions that might sound seductive, but that actually have no backing to them. And then finally, just really briefly, our fourth point was that, it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, it's a kind of a simplistic message, but it is so profoundly applicable to education. We need all of our partners working together. We cannot think that we can do it alone. And schools of education, which has been so demonized in recent years, can play a really vital role. This is where the research happens. This is where the preparation of all school professionals happens. And we need to be seen as partners, just like teachers, just like parents, just like students.
Excellent information. Again, I would highly recommend, if you could tell individuals where to find that article if they would like to read it in depth.
Oh yeah, the article we're talking about came out in a newspaper called Education Week. It's in print. It's also online. It was published on February 8th. And again, the title is, How to Pick a Better Secretary of Education.
Excellent, excellent. So now I'm going to give you, we got to play a little devil's advocate. I'm going to give you a little pushback here because I did a little research on this myself. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not the biggest education buff. That's why we have you on, Kevin. But I did, try and look at this with an open mind and an open perspective. So what do you say to this? I was reading an article in Vox from February 7th. The job of the education secretary isn't to defend public schools. It is to help kids learn. That's the name of the article. And they talk about trends in education that show American schools slipping. So it says this. It says, since 2005, SAT reading scores have dropped by 14 points. A writing component was added to the SAT in 2006, and scores have dropped every year since then, except for the 2 years when they were flat. Math scores for 2015 were the lowest in 20 years. The expanding pool of test takers, a common explanation for the slide, doesn't fully account for it. On the ACT, the measure of college readiness in math, English, reading, and science, slightly more than 1/3 of test takers met the benchmarks in these subjects, while around another third did not meet any of the benchmarks. That means that 1/3 of high school seniors who aim to go to college are unlikely to earn a B in any of those subjects. Now, there's more that I could read, but you kind of get the point. So we can agree, if we can all agree that our education system needs improvement, I won't say it's broken, but I'll say it definitely needs improvement, then what do you say to the people that say we need to do it a completely different way than the way we've been doing it?
Yeah, actually, I would agree that we need to be doing education very differently, and that what we don't want is a secretary who will come in and continue to shape schools the way that they've been running, run schools the way that they've been running for the past decades or even century. So I'm actually in complete agreement. And what I would say is, what's interesting about the declining achievement scores, whether we look at SAT, whether we look at the NAEP or the what's called the Nation Report Card scores, one of the things that we see is that the decline has been going on for decades. That and one of the I think one of the criticisms we can rightfully lodge is that the past few decades has actually been defined by more narrow standards, more high-stakes testing. In other words, a greater focus on more testing and narrowing down the curriculum. And it's not surprising then that our achievement is actually going down. We're teaching kids less rather than more. And the contrast I would give to the declining scores is when we look before the period beginning in the 1980s. In other words, let's look at the 1960s and 70s. Because in the 1960s and 70s was the time in our nation when the achievement gap, the difference in test scores, was actually closing. And what was happening in the really late 50s until like early 70s, what was happening in this time period? This was the middle of the civil rights movement. This was when things were happening like we were attacking inequitable funding, right? This was the War on Poverty. This was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We were diversifying the curriculum with multicultural curriculum. We were trying to diversify the teaching profession with new pathways into teaching. And all of these things came under attack during the conservative revolution that began in the late kind of 70s and into the 80s, that then signaled this new way that we're going to approach education, which was about back to basics, which was about narrow standards, which was about much more high-stakes testing. So I'm not saying that everything we did in the 60s was perfect with education either. But what I am saying is that this moment in time is actually of a particular time period. We've been doing some things in a particular way that many people seem to think is how we've always done things. And the reality is it's not how we've always done things. Mm-hmm. We've not always over-trusted our kids. We've not always kind of diverted public funding or allowed such inequities to exist. And that's what we need to be challenging.
And I would even take it a step further, even in quoting the article that Atiba just read, and that's great information. But the assumption in that article, when you're talking about SAT scores and ACT scores and how they have declined over the last decades, the underlying assumption there is that every student is college bound. And I think that's another issue that we've really lost sight of. I remember when Atiba and I were in junior high school, for example, we had a woodworking class. We had a metal shop class. When we were in high school, there was a vocational track and there was a college prep track. If we put all of our resources in education with the assumption that every child is going to go to college, aren't we setting ourselves up for failure from that perspective, in so much as we're not pushing students to do what they love to do and what they're best at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, we shouldn't measure learning only with these very narrow, rigid, standardized tests, but we also shouldn't narrowly define the goal of schooling. It's become so kind of, the rhetoric we hear is about being college and career ready, as if the only goal for education is to get you ready for like your job in the future. And what I like to remind myself of is throughout the past really 150, 200 years, in our country, we've actually talked about the purpose of education very differently from time to time. Like post-abolition of slavery, during the midst of the civil rights movement, during the midst of kind of labor organizing in the earlier 20th century, these were moments when different communities were saying, actually, the purpose of schools should be linked to these larger social struggles that we're engaged in. In other words, this is when you'd hear people use language like schooling is for liberation, education for freedom, education for justice, education for transformation. Schools are not simply about preparing kids to fit into and succeed in the world and the economy as it is. Schools have also been talked about as preparing our next generation to kind of imagine and create the world that does not yet exist, the world as it could be. And I think while that is a really exciting way for many of us to think about schools, you can imagine that for many people, particularly those already in positions of power, that's a scary way to talk about the role of school. And that's why we need to engage in struggling over defining the very purposes and promises of public education.
That was extremely profound what you just said. You know, preparing schools, or preparing children rather, to not just deal with things as they are, but to imagine what is not yet imagined, to create what is not even yet there. I think that is so inspiring. Let me ask you this one final question. What can we do to hold Betsy DeVos accountable? What types of things do we need to be looking out for, and how can we voice that so that it's heard and felt?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, because I feel like whether we have someone in office that we disagree with, or we have someone in office that we love, in both situations, we should not sit back, right? Leaders then individually do not transform an institution or a society. I think about the presidents that were in office at a time of massive social transformation. I think about, for example, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Kennedy and Johnson, Ronald Reagan. Very different political ideologies, very different transformation. But in all instances, they alone were not transforming society. Alongside them and behind them, pushing them, were these very powerful, massive social movements, right? Alongside Lincoln were the abolitionists. Alongside Franklin Roosevelt was the kind of new labor and the left populist. Alongside Johnson was the civil rights movement, and behind Reagan was the conservative and kind of burgeoning corporate reform movement. When we think about our moment now, we need to be asking ourselves, what's the movement that is going to help insist that whoever is in office advances very justice-oriented reform in education? And we see this building, right? We see it building around the protests around kind of banning of immigration and refugees and Muslim targets. We see young people walking out of school on the day that Betsy DeVos was confirmed by the Senate. We saw teachers going on strike over the past few years, not just for salaries, but for push back against school reform. We need to build a larger social movement to insist on a better vision for public education. And I think that is how we hold accountable DeVos or any of our leaders who are trying to change what schools can and should look like for our next generation.
I cannot tell you how appreciative I am of you coming on today, Mr. Kumashiro. The information has been invaluable and enlightening, and I hope our listeners appreciate it as well. Thank you for helping us kind of navigate through this conversation, and we certainly thank you for being on it and hope that you can continue to be a friend of the show.
Tiba and David, thanks so much for inviting me, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, my friend. So an amazing segment there. And let me just say this to kind of wrap it up. I hope whoever is in office, Betsy DeVos or whoever's running education, and surely this is not just on a federal level, this is certainly on a local and state level as well, but I hope it gets fixed, because, somebody gonna be mad at me for saying this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Man, we got some dumb kids. It's not all their fault. Really, a lot of it is not their fault. I just hate that the children that we are turning out in these schools. I'm amazed at all these young kids I see at McDonald's and the dollar store and all these places where they can't even count change, where they can't do basic math functions. When I look on Facebook and I see people who do not know the difference between there, and there. Mm-hmm. Sorry for your lost, LOST.
Wait, I just brought this up again because I mentioned it earlier. If anybody wants to confirm this, Google Betsy DeVos and you will see that it says her background includes experience as a businesswoman, philanthropist, activist, and noted political campaign contributor.
Right.
Nothing in there about education. Nothing in there about
Right.
being trained in that field. So at the end of the day, when we keep putting people in charge of our children who do not have the requisite basic skills to train them, that's what we're going to get. We're going to get there, and there.
Right. Exactly.
Not knowing the difference.
Exactly. I mean, and you just opened up a whole can of worms because we can't put all that on Betsy DeVos' feet. She's been in the office for a week. Does that beg the question then? What did Arnie Duncan do? And you know what I'm saying? Like we can go back and then have that conversation. Not today, but we will. So thank you so much. That was great points, David. We're going to take a quick break, guys. Get ready for our second half. But again, you're watching Humanity in the Headlines on IntellectualRadio.com. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be right back with you. All right, we are back for the second half of Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. Joining me again, as always, Mr. David Seaton. Don't know what I'd do without him, by the way. I just wanted to say that. And the second half, no, I mean that, man.
Check is in the mail, man.
Right. So the second half, man, it's hard to even switch gears. That first half was so good, but we got to because there's so much to talk about. So we've got 6 players from the Patriots at this point that have indicated they will not be making the trip to the White House. And most have indicated that they're doing that out of some sort of political disagreement with the president and his administration. So to kind of set this up, though, I was the larger question we're asking today is, should NFL, or not even NFL, I won't even restrict it to that, should athletes exercise a political voice? Because the common criticism, whenever athletes say something people don't like, and the first thing, the visceral response is to say, well, just shut up and play. Just shut up and throw the ball. Shut up and catch the ball. And I guess that's an easy perspective to take. But, is that what athletes should do? Just go ahead and do what they get paid millions of dollars to do. Because that's the other criticism is you get paid millions of dollars to play basketball, not to talk politics. So, and I know you got, I'm about to let you in, brother.
Okay.
I just wanted to bring this up because it's been a strange week. Under Armour, the CEO, Kevin Plank, said that Donald Trump is a great asset to the country. Steph Curry had something to say about that. He said he agrees with him if you remove the ET from asset. Like I needed another reason to like Steph Curry. So, but Misty Copeland, Under Armour also sponsors Misty Copeland. If you don't know Misty Copeland, she is and an acclaimed ballerina. She is the first African-American performer to be appointed as a principal dancer for American Ballet Theater. And she had this to say. I'm going to read her quote in its entirety. It's a little lengthy, but it's worth it. She said, "I have always appreciated the great support and platform that Under Armour has given me to represent my community, gender, and career on the world stage. However, I strongly disagree with Kevin Plank's recent comments in support of Trump, as recently reported. Those of you who have supported and followed my career know that the one topic I've never backed away from speaking openly about is the importance of diversity and inclusion. It is imperative to me that my partners and sponsors share this belief. I have spoken at length with Kevin privately about the matter, but as someone who takes my responsibility as a role model very seriously, it is important to me that he and UA, Under Armour, take public action to clearly communicate and reflect our common values in order for us to effectively continue to work towards our shared goal of trying to motivate all people to be their best selves," end quote. Joining us, I'm sorry, before we bring our guest on, we have an excellent guest today, guys, so sit tight, you're gonna love this. But David, go ahead and give me your thoughts.
You know, when we were doing the show prep for this particular segment, I remembered what you said on our inaugural show on Intellectual Radio. You said, before we're black, before we're white, before we're gay or straight or anything, we're human. And to attack the humanity of these professional football players for making a political statement, they're not going out and protesting. They're not going out and beating anybody up. All they're doing is not going to the White House. And again, you know, we'll probably delve into this a little bit more deeply in the conversation, but there was no outrage when Tom Brady didn't go to the White House in 2015.
Absolutely.
That was only, you know, we are trying to act like that's ancient history. And I want to bring our guest on, but just remember the names Tommy Smith and John Carlos, because I want to bring those back up at the end of this segment.
Absolutely. So joining us today, again, to help us navigate this conversation and give us some enlightenment is our good friend, Mr. David C. Steele. He is a writer for sportingnews.com and author of Silent Gesture. Mr. Steele, how are you today?
I am great, and thanks so much for having me on for this discussion.
Absolutely. You've been on with us before. Last time you came on with us, we were talking about Ray Rice.
Right.
If you remember that. But Mr. Steele, if you can go ahead and give us your initial thoughts on this whole thing with the Patriots players deciding so quickly, by the way, and voicing so quickly that they will not be going to the White House. What did you initially think when you heard that from Martellus Bennett?
Well, Martellus Bennett hinted at it the week before the game when the players first arrived in Houston and did the big nationally televised sort of opening introduction to the game, and there were all these big interviews at all the podiums, and they're all on live TV and stuff like that. And that also, of course, was I think a day after the Muslim ban was put into effect, and it was just absolute chaos at these airports all over the place. And Martellus Bennett was really the only person on either team that really answered a question that didn't have anything to do with the game itself. I think he was asked at the time, "Do you know what you're going to do if you go to if the Patriots win? Would you go to the White House?" And he said no, he wouldn't. And the rest of that night, several players from both teams were asked, "What do you think about the ban? What do you think about his moves? What do you think about him as president? What are you thinking about the possibility of going to the White House if that comes up?" Tom Brady, of course, is asked about a million questions because he has been Mr. Make America Great Again with his hat.
Right.
And they all dodged the question. Martellus Bennett didn't. And he stuck to his word when the time came. They won the Super Bowl, and the possibility became a reality. And he said, "No, I'm still not going." It feels as if I think that there were probably teammates who were leaning that way and who were probably going to be a little bit low key about it. But I think that his being so open, so honest, so demonstrative about it, I think nudged them in the right direction, and in order for them to say, "Hey, I will be okay with making this a public stance, with making this a public statement, not keeping it low key, not keeping it sort of under the radar." I think Martellus Bennett ended up being kind of a unifying force among those who felt like they wanted to do something but weren't sure exactly what they wanted to do.
Wow. So just for the record, I'd like to go ahead and indicate the players from the Patriots that have indicated they won't be going. That includes Devin McCourty. He's a safety. Other members include linebacker Dante Hightower, also running back LeGarrette Blount, and defensive tackle Alan Branch. There's one other player, defensive end Chris Long, indicated he would not be going. Those players have a lot in common, except one of them is white.
Right.
Which is kind of cool. It's actually very cool. And that would be the defensive end, Chris Long. Can you speak to that and the history that Chris Long has as far as speaking out against I guess, not having equal rights?
Yeah, he's been vocal about athletes expressing social activism and certainly expressing it in that way. Now, of course, virtually every player in the NFL was asked about Colin Kaepernick's protest beginning of the year. Chris Long said he was in favor of it, said that he supported it, said that he understood why he was doing it, and probably most important of all, he said he understood that as a white player, this is something that most of the time he's not asked about. Yet, he felt he had to take a stand because he had to recognize that the privilege that he had as a white citizen, a white American, a white football superstar, and a white legacy, to football stardom because he's Howie Long's son, gave him advantages that players like Colin Kaepernick and the other players who were supporting him did not. And he felt it was important to add his voice to it to make sure everybody recognizes that what he was, benefiting from, white privilege and white celebrity, was something that he recognized and that everybody else needs to recognize as well. So to see him sort of stand out among the guys who are refusing to go to the White House, it's important. And you also know that it wasn't any sort of a sudden decision. It's not a first-time decision. It's not a rash decision. It's something that he has been aware of for a while, and something that he spoke about, when this entire issue sort of bubbled to the surface, beginning of the year with Colin Kaepernick.
Sure. So one of the things that I'd like to add, thank you for all of that perspective. I'd like to add something to that. I'm going to actually read a quote from ESPN.com, an article that was written September 14th, an interview with him. And he said this, quote, "And I respect the anthem. I would never kneel for it. We all come from different walks of life and think differently about the anthem and the flag and what that means. But I think you can respect and find a lot of truth in what these guys are talking about and not kneel. Those aren't mutually exclusive ideas," end quote. So and the reason I picked that quote is because so many times we have these conversations and it's always this zero-sum type of framing that, you're either 100% this way or 100% that way. And I appreciate his point is that you can not even kneel yourself, but still understand that there's truth in what these people are going through. And I think we really need to start in the middle there.
No, absolutely. And, it was an important distinction for him to make because the way the response came on Colin Kaepernick's protest, the way it was sort of addressed and designed by pretty much everybody, how the entire opposition was built, it was that either you're this or you're that. If you are kneeling or sitting or raising your fist for the anthem, then that must mean that you don't love this country, that you love this, that, and et cetera, et cetera. And Chris Long said, no, that's not true. One is not tied to the other. It can go both ways. And I think that everybody who's involved in this and who's doing this says that. There's no way you would put it on these 6 players to say they disrespect this country, they disrespect the office of the presidency, they disrespect the meaning of a White House visit and things like that. No, they're opposed to the man who's sitting in that seat very clearly, and then very demonstratively. And then they're making a very specific, serious point in what they're doing. And this is really kind of at the roots of all protests. And protests are designed to get people's attention in exactly that way, and to send a certain message through a medium that people understand. And, they've been very successful in, whether you're standing or kneeling or raising a fist during the anthem, or if you're making a conscious decision not to go to the White House. And it's also worth mentioning, by the way, when you mentioned all the players who are refusing to go, Devin McCourty and Martellus Bennett were two Patriots players who, beginning of the year, supported Colin Kaepernick by raising their fists during the national anthem of games.
Exactly, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'll touch on that towards the end of the conversation. Again, remember those names: Tommy Smith and John Carlos. David Seaton here, and again, thank you for being with us today, Mr. Steele. Let's do a quick thought experiment. Let me play devil's advocate and say that not kneeling during the national anthem and raising your fist. Let's say I want to play devil's advocate and say, so what? Let's do a thought experiment and say, what if these players, these African American players that are in a very unique position of power to affect social change, instead of not participating in the national anthem or raising their fists, what if they took it to the next level and said, you know what, we're going to not play a game, or we're going to skip a couple of games, and we're going to do something, we're going to make a more demonstrable statement and actually put some skin in the game. Is it too easy to just not kneel during the national anthem to try and make a statement, and your biggest blowback is you get some negative feedback on Twitter?
I think that minimizes what they're doing, because we saw what the actual reaction was, that it really doesn't take much to push people's buttons when it comes to issues like this. I think that if it was to be characterized as quote unquote just kneeling or just raising your fist, then literally to this day, and I know I don't mean to jump ahead, because I know we're going to talk about Tommy Smith and John Carlos later. Those two men are in their 70s. They're still getting people cursing at them, death threats, calling them traitors. Muhammad Ali, just a year ago, passed away. He refused to step into to take the step forward, take the oath to join the army. And literally on the day he died, there were people who were still making a point to call him Cassius Clay, to not refer to him by his full name, to deny what he did, to not call him a hero, to continue to call him a coward and a traitor and a draft dodger. So in the state in the state of social activism and protest are in right now, there really are no small gestures. So
Absolutely.
That's a pretty big gesture that they all made.
Well, you know what that reminds me of?
If they did make that step, then that would almost be like earthquake level, tsunami level,
right?
Reaction.
Well, let me say this.
It's interrupting something even bigger than just the national anthem.
Yeah, what that reminds me of, though, is a T-shirt I saw recently. It's like, we sit, y'all mad. We protest, y'all mad. We march, y'all mad. We die, y'all silent. So it just begs that question, because there is no right way to protest. You've never heard people say, they always criticize, well, if I don't like that he kneeled, I wish he did something else. You never hear them actually say what is the acceptable way to protest, because it doesn't matter. Like I said, if we sit, y'all mad, it just doesn't matter. So like you, I would agree that I know you're just playing devil's advocate, but
right.
But like you, I would agree that any gesture, no matter how benign it may seem to us, turns out to be a huge gesture, among the masses.
And again, let me just follow up with what I was saying. If the purpose of protest is to affect change, and the protest that we're doing right now is just eliciting an emotional response, do we have a responsibility to take it to the next level with our protest if the end result that we want is change? Mr. Steele.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting part of it. It's the purpose is to wake people up, change the way they're thinking, challenge the way they're thinking, challenge the way they're doing things. And this is where you go into the responsibility of those athletes themselves. I know you started out the conversation by saying so many people push back against the fact that, hey, you're only there to entertain us. You're only there to, put on a show for us. Shut up and play, stick to sports, all those kind of things. Once you've taken the platform that you have and speaking from it, the responsibility at some point has to be picked up by the rest of society, by the people. If you're inspiring people, then at some point the people have to actually do something with that inspiration.
Sure.
I mean, I think that at a certain point, you can't go from you guys shouldn't do anything and jump directly to you guys should do everything.
Right.
Sure.
the entire point is to engage the entire country in a way that they can't miss what your point is, and to catch them when they're paying attention the most. And it's funny that Colin Kaepernick's, this whole thing started, with Colin Kaepernick during a preseason game, which supposedly is the most meaningless, form of
right.
sports-related entertainment ever conceived. And yet it was it was before a preseason game. Nobody's even watching the game, much less what the players are doing during the national anthem. Yet that's what this sprang from. And now this is going to, one of the, it's an important, moment in our collective memories. It's something that everybody anticipates when their team wins a championship. Hey, they get to go to the White House. That's so much fun. They have the sort of memories tucked away from them and stuff. For that to be disrupted, when it really is just a glorified photo op, it really doesn't change anything. Right. To say, hey, the Bulls went to the White House for the 6th time, or the Patriots are going for the 5th time. They shake hands, they wave, they give him the jersey with his name on it, and they toss the football or the basketball around, stuff like that. All of a sudden, that sort of routine gesture is being shook up in a way that it gets everybody's attention again. So once again, they're eliciting a response, and at a certain point, the people who they're aiming at are going to have to do something about it and take the ball. Literally, I hate using that metaphor in this case. Pick up the ball and run with it.
Right. And again, I don't want to give too much power, I guess, to athletes, because at the end of the day, they are entertainers. So let me say that, and I don't want to over glorify their position, but they are in a very unique position just because of where we find ourselves in our culture right now, be it good or bad. Athletes and entertainers have an elevated voice that people pay attention to. I just wonder, and again, that's why I prefaced it by just saying, let's do a thought experiment. I just wonder that if we're going to use athletes and if we're going to use entertainers as the conduit to get a message out there about social ills and the things that we need to address in our larger society, do they have a responsibility to take it to the next level, and do we have a responsibility to ask them to take it to the next level? Your point before being that certainly they might be the catalyst, and it's up to the rest of us to follow their lead, for lack of a better word. But I just wonder, again, not kneeling during the national anthem is going to get a lot of vitriol on Twitter, but at the end of the day, is it going to change the consciousness that needs to be changed in our society to get more equitable treatment for minorities and people of color?
Well, let me jump in on that. Because I don't think that's the responsibility of it. I think when athletes or celebrity is a better word, use that kind of platform, it is to raise consciousness, and that's really all it can do. It's really up to our leaders, our politicians, to what would Muhammad Ali be? Do we care about Muhammad Ali and his stance, or do we care about the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act? Those things that actually get passed, those are the things that actually affect the change that we're looking for. So we can't expect, I think that's a lofty expectation of the athletes or the celebrities to push it to that level. But I do appreciate the fact that they are willing to, because no matter what it is, no matter how, Colin Kaepernick not only caught a lot of flack on Twitter, you have no idea how much money he lost in revenue based on individuals that will not take him on as a sponsor now. You never know how that's going to impact his ability to even stay a San Francisco 49er. If he gets let go this year, in all probability, it had something to do with the fact that he was the center of so much attention on the team. Your thoughts, Mr. Steele?
No, absolutely. I agree 100%. I think athletes who make the time and effort to protest are taking more of a risk than I think a lot of people really appreciate. Because if you listen to the specific backlash that they're getting, much of it is, who are you to complain? Yep. Look how successful you are. Look how great everything is for you. I mean, Colin Kaepernick heard it nonstop. Oh, how oppressed are you? You make $12 million a year. Look, I found a photo of you leaning against your Ferrari. Look at the house that you live in. And the message is, it's not even a subtle message. It's that you people have nothing to complain about, right. And yet you're complaining, trying to get something that you don't deserve. Look at how great you are. How bad could your situation be when some of you make tens of millions of dollars to play a sport? It's a really insidious message, but these athletes take it on by saying, I'm willing to risk that by standing up for all the people who you don't listen to, who don't have the opportunities that we do, who want to do something else besides the 2 or 3 paths that America rewards us for our success in, sports and entertainment, basically. And saying, we're willing to give that up. And these Patriots players, football, you know anything about the structure of how football players live, the team could cut them at any time. Right. Their contracts are written such that, they could be gone tomorrow. Kaepernick could be cut tomorrow. Garrett Blunt cut tomorrow. No matter how good they are, they will tell you, we will find somebody cheaper and even if he's
less
not
controversial,
good, and somebody who's quieter
right.
than you, who's not going to risk that. This is, so that's the value of them stepping out to take that, because they have a big platform, but the nature of sports is it doesn't last very long. Their careers can end in a heartbeat.
I think the average NFL player the average career is 3 years.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
3 years.
Well, again, I think that's an interesting point that you made, and I'll just finish it up by saying that all it would take is for Kaepernick or for any one of these NFL professional athletes to just be caught in the wrong city at the wrong time of day by a police officer or by a local that doesn't follow the sport, and their celebrity won't save them in that respect. It won't save them in that set of circumstances. So that's why I'm saying that. Again, not to give too much power to athletes and to celebrities, but if they are going to go out there and try to make a statement, then perhaps we need to ask them we need to evaluate the worth of what it is that they're doing and if it's going to get us to our end goal. But Mr. Steele, we appreciate you coming on today and discussing this topic. It's a multi-layered topic and we could go on forever about it, but we appreciate you coming on today. I'm very, very happy to come on, and I appreciate every time you guys invite me, and it's been a pleasure. I love this topic. Excellent. If you could just tell our listeners real quick how they can follow you. Well, I am, as you said, I write for sportingnews.com, so you can find me there. I am on Facebook at Sporting News' page and on my own page, which is David Christopher Steele. And I am on Twitter at David_C, as in Christopher, _Steele. Make sure you put the E at the end. And just to remind everybody, you get a chance to get into it a lot, this is actually the 10th anniversary, almost to the day, of when Silent Gesture hit the bookshelves. So, all right. Congratulations, my friend. If you get a chance to go check it out, you can still get it. It's on Amazon and all the other book sites, and also at TommySmith.com. So excellent. Please do. Thank you so much for joining us today, man, and we look forward to having you on next time. Thanks very much for having me. You guys take care. You got it. So I guess we can wrap it up now. Wrap it up with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, in case anyone forgets. They were the two individuals in the 1968 Olympics that they gave the Black Power salute from winning the gold and the bronze medals respectively in the 200-meter race. Yep. Absolutely. So this isn't a new phenomenon that athletes and celebrities get blowback when they try to mix in their politics, especially as it pertains to the African American community. Well, as you said first, they're human first. Exactly. And they feel, even if they don't feel it personally,
individually, they still feel the pain of other people, and as you should do if you're a human. But
Exactly.
nonetheless, that's what we're about, humanity in the headlines. We're going to remind you of that every single time. So thanks for listening, and thanks for watching IntellectualRadio.com and Humanity in the Headlines. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching Facebook.